I appreciate so much the invitation to come back and be with you again and the opportunity to be with you. I enjoyed my stay with you in the previous studies a few years back, and I'm looking forward to the things we have planned for this week. I'll say more at the next hour about the things we have planned, but I look forward to the week, and I hope you'll make your plans to be at every service. But I want to start, because of limited time, and focus on the subject that has been announced and been advertised on your website. Let's talk for a little while about the fear of God. What is the fear of God? Well, it's one of the most impressive subjects in all of the Bible. I'm convinced. The more I study it, the more I see, and the more I begin to be impressed with the fact that this is absolutely an impressive subject, one of the most impressive subjects. This is a subject that most people do not understand what fear is and what it means. By that I simply mean, if we were to go down the street and begin to ask people, what does it mean to fear God? Some would give one idea, some would give something contradictory to that, and some would even give another. Some would say, I'll tell you what the fear of God means. It means you're scared and afraid of God, and that's true, but that's only partly true. And someone else said, oh, no, that's not fear. What fear means is that you respect God and stand in awe of God, and that is true, but that's only partly true. So what does it mean to fear? Not all Christians fear God, and I put Christians in quotations. Just because someone has been baptized and because they go to church all of the time does not mean they fear God. There are a number of people who've been baptized and they really don't deeply fear God, and you'll see why I say that in a few moments. They may go to church all of the time, but they still don't deeply fear God. So again, I ask, what does it mean to fear God? People who are not living as they should, the reason they don't live as they should is they don't fear God. A number of years ago, the elders were standing around trying to analyze how could we help this particular individual that wasn't doing what they should, and we were trying to ask each other, what do you think the problem is? And one of us would say, well, I think it's his friends. You know who he runs with. Well, yeah, that's part of the problem. Someone else said, I think it's family. Family is the problem. And, well, that's true. Family has a great deal to do with that. And someone else said, well, I think it's where he works. You just think of the environment he works in. And we begin to name a number of things, but we finally settled on the fact that, you know what, the real problem is he does not fear God. And if he feared God, everything else will take care of itself. So again, I emphasize, just because one claims to be a Christian does not mean they truly fear God. Now, I have a twofold objective this morning, and I hope we accomplish both. Here's the first. I hope that when we get through with this study this morning, that you are more determined to walk in the fear of God than you ever have been before. And I assume by your presence this morning that you are one who already fears God and you want to fear God, but if I could rekindle that a little bit to the point that you have a greater determination when this study is through, that you say, you know what, I am more determined now than ever before. I want to fear God. We could end the meeting at that point, and we've had a successful meeting, haven't we? But there's another objective I hope to accomplish, and I want to challenge you to study more on the fear of God. And I don't mean by that, why don't you just take a lesson one Wednesday night and let's all study on the fear of God. That'd be a great study. But I want to challenge you to do this. From this point forward, every time you hear in a sermon or a class or your Bible reading, or you see the term fear as it is directed toward God, pause for a moment, underline that word fear, and raise the question in your mind, what does this text teach me about fear? It may be defining fear. It may be an example of one who fears. It may be telling me that if you fear, you'll do this. It may be saying that if you fear God, you don't do that. And I think you'll find that to be one of the most rewarding studies you've ever done. And so it's not something you're going to do on a Saturday and say, take 2 or 3 hours. But from this point forward, every time you see the term fear, you underline that in your Bible as it is directed toward God, that is, and raise the question, what do I learn about fear in this context? Now, I've issued that challenge in places, and then go back into the area 5 or 6 or 7 years later and had people come to me and say, you know what, I took you up on that challenge, and that has been one of the most rewarding studies I've done. I would like to issue that challenge to you. Do some study on the fear of God. And if we can accomplish those two things, our time will be well spent. Now let's start with this. Let's talk about what fear means. What does it mean to fear God? Fear is like the two sides of a coin. You have a heads and you have a tails. They are distinct, but they are inseparable. The head is not the same as the tails. They're different. You just look at the heads of the coin and the tail, and they're just totally different. They're not the same. But at the same time, they are inseparable. Have you ever gone to the bank and said, I'd like to buy a roll of those quarters, but I want y'all to keep the heads, and I'm going to take the tails, or vice versa? Has that ever worked? Can't do that. You see, if you take the heads, you have to take the tails with it because they are inseparable, but they're not the same thing. So as we talk about fear, there's the two sides of the coin of fear. On the one side of the coin of fear, fear involves being afraid of displeasing God. And someone would be quick to say, oh, I think the fear of God involves something else too. But that's the other side of the coin. That's like looking at a quarter and say, that's not a quarter because mine's got an eagle on it. Well, you're looking at the wrong side. You're looking at the one side of the aspect of fear. So let's start with 1 Samuel chapter 11 and in verse 7. This is a classic in defining fear on this side of that coin of fear. And so what do I mean? Well, let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 11 and in verse 7. This is where Saul and Samuel are trying to rally the people to go to battle. And notice what the text says. So they took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hand of the messenger, saying, Who does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so shall it be done to his oxen. Now, stop there for a moment, we'll come back. Get the picture. They're trying to rally the people to go to battle, and what they do is they take a yoke of oxen and cut them up into bloody chunks of meat. And they send messengers out with this bloody chunk of meat, and they come knocking on your door, and they stand there with this bloody chunk of meat dripping at the door, and they tell you that the same thing that was done to this oxen will be done to every one of yours if you don't go with us to battle. Now, your oxen is not that one or two out there in the field that's your pet, but that is your 401k. That's your investment. That's your income. That's how you make your living. And so every one of your oxen is going to be treated this way if you don't go with us. How would you have reacted? The text says, and the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they went out with one consent. Well, no wonder. They were afraid not to. So fear here in this context is used in the sense of being afraid of displeasing God. But let's go further. Let's look at some more passages, and this time let's go to the book of Psalms. Go with me to the book of Psalms, and in Psalm 119, if you will, and notice verse 120. Psalm 119 and verse 120. My flesh trembles for fear of you. I am afraid of your judgments. Here the term fear is used again with reference or in the context of our fear of displeasing God. I tremble at your judgments. Let's go again. Let's go to the book of Isaiah, if you will. Let's go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 66, and in verse 2. For all those things my hand has made, and all those things exist, says the Lord. But on this one will I look, on him who is poor and of a contrite spirit. Now you're reading with me, and who trembles at my word. And so we ought to tremble at the word of God when we look at what he says and what he condemns and what he forbids and what he commands me to do. I ought to tremble. I'm afraid of displeasing God. Let's go to two New Testament passages, and we often quote these together. Let's go to the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, and notice in verse 31. Verse 31 says, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now, the reason we quote chapter 12 and 29 in context is in connection, that is not in context, but in connection, is because it tells me the reason for that. Our God is a consuming fire. It is a fearful thing to fall into his hands because he is a consuming fire. So all of these texts and a host of others that we could cite, on that side of the coin of fear, it has to do with being afraid of displeasing God. Are you afraid of displeasing God? In other words, here is a command God has given, and does it bother you and make you afraid to not do that command? Or here is something God has forbidden. Does that scare you to do that which is forbidden? Do you tremble at that? That's afraid of displeasing God. That's described as fear. Now let's turn that coin over and look on the other side of the coin. And fear also involves awe and respect for God. Standing in awe of his majesty, his power, and his might. And that has to be coupled with, of course, this being afraid of displeasing God. But we've turned the coin over and we're looking at the other side now. Now, Luke 7 is just as much a classic in defining that aspect as 1 Samuel 11 is on the other side. So let's go to Luke chapter 7, set the context. This is the case of the raising of the son of the widow of Nain. Jesus is making his way into a city of the city of Nain, a walled city. And as he's making his way into the city, coming out of the gate of the city is what we would call a funeral procession. So let's notice what the text says. And then he came and touched the open coffin, that is a stretcher as we would think of it, where they're carrying the dead. And those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Now, how would you react? We'll come back to the verse in a moment. How would you react to that? Let's suppose you're sitting in a funeral procession. You've gone to a funeral, and you're about 3 or 4 cars behind the family car, and in front of that's the hearse. You pull out onto the highway, headed to the cemetery, and just as you get out on the highway, here comes somebody driving up, and they're waving their arms, and they stop the traffic. They go over to the hearse and open the back door, pull the coffin open, flip open the lid, and raise the person from the dead. And take them back and put them in the family car and introduce them now to their family as being alive. And you're 3 or 4 cars back. Would you lock your doors and be afraid? I'm afraid he's going to come over here and touch me. No, you wouldn't be afraid of him. You'd be standing in awe of his power. Wow, something has happened that's different. Let's go further. Let's read now beginning at verse 15. So he that was dead, he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Now notice verse 16. Verse 16 said, "Then fear came upon all." What do you mean fear came upon all? "And they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people." They're not afraid of God at this point. They're not afraid in the sense, as we talked about in 1 Samuel chapter 11, afraid to act. They're standing in awe. God's been here today. A great prophet has been here today. And that was called the fear of God. Now let's notice another passage. Let's go to the book of Jonah, if you will. I'm convinced that Jonah, in Jonah chapter 1 and in verse 9, is focusing on this side of the coin of fear. Because Jonah identifies himself to the people on the boat that I am a Hebrew and I fear the Lord. What do you mean, Jonah, you fear the Lord? The God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. He's not focusing so much, I'm afraid of displeasing God. I'm not saying he didn't have that. That's not his focal point here. I fear God. What do you mean you fear God? The God who created everything, the sea and the dry land. That's what he's focusing upon. Now let's go to the book of Deuteronomy. You see that on the screen before you, Deuteronomy, the 28th division. We're going to say more about Deuteronomy in a few moments, being a book that says as much or more than any other book on the fear of God. But notice what he says, that I do, if you do not carefully observe all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may, here's our term, fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God. Now notice you're fearing, how does he word it? This glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God. So what I want you to see is that fear involves 2 sides of the coin. On the one side, it's afraid of displeasing God, but on the other side of that coin is the aspect of fear, of respect and awe of his majesty, his power, and his might. They are distinct, but they are inseparable. Now let's turn and talk about another aspect of fear, that fear is our purpose in life. It's what life is all about. So let's get our Bibles and open up to the book of Ecclesiastes, and you might, I'm going to get to chapter 12, but I'm going to peruse through the first 11 and a half chapters or so rather quickly in just kind of a summary fashion. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the question is all about what is man's purpose in life? What's life under the sun all about? What are we to be doing here? Living life under the sun. What's it all about? And the preacher pursues a number of things like pleasure. And he found out that pleasure was just vanity of vanities. All is vanity, he would say. In other words, that's not what man's life's all about. He pursues after wealth, and he finds out, you know what? Wealth isn't what life's all about. He gained much wealth. He pursued after wisdom. None were any wiser than Solomon. And now he has come to the end, and he says, you know what? I found out that also is vanity of vanities. He had power, and he had fame. And we could go on listing other principles, but here are things he pursued after and attained. And he said, all of that's just vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So what is man's purpose in life? And so we come to the passage you know well, and every person present probably could quote it, if not the whole thing, at least a portion thereof. And so in Ecclesiastes 12:13, he said, this is the King James rendering, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, there's our expression, and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. This is what makes man complete. This is what makes man whole, and this is his whole responsibility before God. To do what? To fear God and keep his commandments. See, I may go through life and I may pursue power and I attain power, but if I obtain power, but I don't fear God, then I'm not doing my purpose in life. I'm not fulfilling my purpose in life. Same thing with wisdom or wealth or pleasure. Now, there are three conclusions I want to draw from that. Simple, but hopefully they come across as being powerful. What conclusions do I draw? Number one, if we fail in that, then we have utterly failed in life. Would you agree with that? In other words, what if I'm successful in gaining power or wealth or pleasure, but I don't fear God and I don't keep his commandments, then I have failed in life. Someone said, well, preacher, wait a minute, you don't understand. I've done quite well financially and I've gained a lot of money, more than you will ever have. Well, that's probably true. But if the purpose in life is to fear God and keep his commandments and I'm not doing that, then I have failed in life. I'm a failure. Now let's flip that coin over. If I fear God and keep his commandments, but I didn't have that wealth and I didn't have the education, I don't have the power and I don't have the fame, but I do fear God, I am a success in life. Would you agree with that? All right, here's the second conclusion. If our children do not fear God, we have failed in the rearing and the raising of our children. I recognize Proverbs 22:6, train a child in the way that he should go, and when he's old and not depart from it, is a proverb, meaning it's a general statement to which there would be exceptions. I understand that. But I'm talking in the general term. And that is, if my purpose or man's purpose in life is to fear God, and I raise my children, and they don't fear God, then something went wrong in the rearing and the raising of those children. And again, someone's quick to say, well, I'll tell you what, preacher, I put my kid through the finest of schools, and they have a great education. Do they fear God? You don't understand the talent my child has, but do they fear God and keep his commandments? Did you teach them to fear God and keep his commandments? Here's a third conclusion. If that's our purpose in life, then those who do not fear God have no real meaning in life. I don't have the answers. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist. I don't have all the answers as to why people take their own lives, but I think, to say the least, there are some who would take their lives because they don't understand they have a purpose in life of fearing God and keeping his commandments. I may fail in finances. I may start a business and it didn't go well. I may have tried my hand at education and I didn't seem to learn it too well, but if I fear God, I've been a success. I don't view myself as a failure. And those who don't fear God have no real meaning in life. And life holds no value. Now let's turn to a third section. Let's talk about some examples of those who feared God. Now, when I mention that, you would think, because of how important fear is, that every page of the Bible, you just start with Genesis 1, and you could just turn the page, and every person who was seemingly a decent person would be described as a person who feared God. This one feared God, and that one feared God, and this one feared God, and that one. And we could just list hundreds of examples. Well, we probably could by definition, but the text doesn't tag the term fear to very many. That's interesting to me. So let's look at a few of those where the text does. First of all, here was Joseph, identified himself to his brothers. Do you remember his brothers didn't know for a while that this was their brother? And so let's go to Genesis chapter 42 and look at verse 18. When the time comes for him to identify himself to his brothers, Joseph said to them the third day, "Do this and live, for I fear God." Do you describe yourself as you introduce yourself to someone or identify, "I am so-and-so and I fear God"? Do you? I'm not saying you have to use that phrase. I'm just simply saying, do you try to leave the impression that you fear God? He's a man who said he feared God. Jonah did the same thing. We already quoted the passage earlier, read it earlier, that Jonah said, "I fear God who made the sea and the dry land." Jonah identified himself to the people on the boat. I fear God. So here's two cases. There's Joseph and there's Jonah, and they both say, "You know what? I fear God." Nehemiah used an interesting phrase, and this is the only time I know this to be used. Nehemiah identified himself and the people of the post-exile period as those who desire to fear your name. I don't think that means we want to, but we don't, but we are those who not only fear, but we want to fear you. We desire to fear your name. Nehemiah 1 and verse 11. Hananiah is identified, and this is the only time this phrase is used, who is identified as one who feared God more than many. That tells me there are degrees of fear. That this one fears God and this one fears God, but this one may fear God more than this man fears God. That's interesting. Would you be described as one who feared God more than many? Only time that phrase is used to my knowledge. But here's a classic. Genesis 22 and in verse 12. It's one thing to say, "I fear God," like Joseph and Jonah. It's another thing to say, "We fear God," like Nehemiah said. It's even another thing to point to someone and say, "He fears God more than many," but in this case, this is where God said he fears God. So turn to Genesis 22 and verse 12. In Genesis 22:12, the text tells us this is where God had told Abraham to go and to slay his son, and notice the wording at verse 12. Notice at Genesis chapter 22 and in verse 12. He said, "Now I know you fear God. Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything, for now I know that you fear God." And that's the only text that I know where that particular phrase is used, "Now I know you fear God." Would God say that about you? Here's a case of obedience to the utmost without question and without doubt. I'm going to obey God to the utmost. Now let's talk about fear in the Pentateuch. And the reason I mentioned that, fear is going to be found in Genesis. We're going to find it in Leviticus, and most especially in Deuteronomy. Now, when I mention Deuteronomy, by the very name given to the book, suggests a second giving of the law, or really more a re-emphasis or reiteration of the law. Here is on the eve of crossing over the Jordan and conquering the land, And so for about a period of 30 days, Moses is preaching to the people, re-emphasizing the law to them, and one of the common themes is the fear of God is found time and again. So if you want to do some study on the fear of God and you say, what book would you say you start with, go to the book of Deuteronomy and find every time the term fear is used, and that's going to be a fascinating study for you. So let's list what we learned from the Pentateuch. That the fear of God means you're going to do whatever God says. So let's get our Bibles open and let's turn to the book of Deuteronomy now and trace some of these references quickly. Deuteronomy 6 and in verse 2, I just want you to notice how the term fear is used and then what's said that you will do because of fear. That you may fear the Lord your God, there's our term, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you and your sons, and you and your son and your grandson all the days of your life, that your days may be prolonged. So notice fear is connected with doing all his commandments. All right, let's go over to Deuteronomy chapter 8, and notice in verse 6. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God. There's the keeping of the commandments mentioned first, to walk in his ways and to fear him. All right, let's go to another. I'm just trying to get a flavor of how often, how many times the concept of fear is used. Deuteronomy 13 and in verse 4. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice and serve him and hold fast to him. Let's go again. This time, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 17 and in verse 19. And it shall be with him that he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe all the words of this law and statutes. So in all of those, are you seeing the connection? The text mentions fear God and keep all of his commandments. Keep all of his commandments and fear God. There's a connection between the two. So if I fear God, what difference is it going to make in my life if I start fearing God today when I haven't been fearing him before? I'm going to start doing whatever God says. But there's another aspect found in the Pentateuch, and that is that I'm going to be dedicated and devoted. Dedicated and devoted. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 10 and notice verse 12. Look at verse 12, Deuteronomy 10 and verse 12. Notice fear in connection with the concept of devotion. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord God require of you but to fear the Lord your God and to walk in all of his ways and to love him and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul? He's giving everything you have into the service of God connected with fear. Drop down to verse 20. And you shall fear the Lord your God and serve him and hold fast and take oaths in his name. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy 17:19. We were there just a moment ago. Not only is obedience mentioned, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God and be careful to observe all the words of these statutes. But notice back now at the first part of the verse. He shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn and to carefully observe. That's dedication, that's devotion. Let's go again. Deuteronomy 31. I'm trying to give you the flavor again of how many times. You say we're seeing the same thing over and over, but I want to leave you with an impression. Deuteronomy goes over and over and over and over and over again dealing with the concept of fear. Deuteronomy 31 and in verse 12, gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the strangers who is within your gates, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God. And what does that mean? And carefully observe all the words of the law. That's dedication. That's devotion. One more passage along that line. Let's go back to Deuteronomy. We've already been here. To Deuteronomy chapter 28 and in verse 58. If you do not carefully observe all the words that are written in this book, that you may fear the glorious and awesome name of the Lord your God. Again, the idea of dedication and devotion tied with fear. But there's something else that fear involves, and it involves a hatred and a ceasing of sin. Now this is interesting to me in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus 20 ought to ring a bell to us, because Exodus chapter 20 is the giving of the 10 Commandments. And on the heels of giving of the 10 Commandments, Moses said, do not fear For God has come to test you that his fear may be before you, so that you might not sin. That's interesting. Here are the Ten Commandments. Don't fear man. Don't fear anything else but fear God. Well, what's that got to do with these Ten Commandments? That you might not sin. Fear involves me hating sin and ceasing from sin. But now this is an interesting concept here. In the Pentateuch, we're going to see that fear involves respect for and treating other people right. In other words, I treat my neighbor right because of my fear of God. Now let's see this. Let's start with Genesis 20 and verse 11. Genesis 20 and verse 11. Do you remember Abraham lying about Sarah being his sister? Remember that? This is his explanation for that. And he said, because I thought surely the fear of God is not in this place and they'll kill me on the account of my wife. Now, Abraham, why'd you do that? Well, he said, I didn't think these people over here feared God. Okay, what's that got to do with anything? If they don't fear God, they just soon kill me as not. They're not going to treat me right if they don't fear God. See, that was the problem. All right, let's go again. Let's go to the book of Leviticus this time. This is where this concept gets interesting, is in Leviticus now. Leviticus chapter 19, and let's look at verse 14. And I want you to see that the term fear is used in the context of don't mistreat someone but fear them. So let's start with verse 14. You shall not curse the deaf nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but, now stop there. What has he just said? Don't curse the deaf, don't put a stumbling block before the blind, but, now what I'm expecting it to say is treat them right. And that is what it says, but it words it differently. But you shall fear your God. Wait a minute, what's that got to do? You see, if I fear God, I am going to treat them right. See the point? All right. Verse 32. Drop down to verse 32. Same context. You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. Show respect for those who are older and fear God. There is a connection between the two. Let's go again to this time Leviticus chapter 25. Go to Leviticus chapter 25 and notice starting with verse 17. You shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord. Don't mistreat, but treat people right, and he says it by saying fear God. Drop down to verse 36. You shall take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God. Now, by the way, as a footnote here, remember from your studies of the book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah condemned the people for exacting usury, that he condemned them for not fearing God. He's, in essence, quoting this very verse we're just talking about, Leviticus 25 and in verse 36. Now drop down to verse 43. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. So notice in all of these references, don't mistreat someone. And again, we're expecting it to say, but treat them right. That's not the wording. The wording is, but fear God. So it means if one fears God, they're going to treat other people with respect and treat them right. I want to spend the rest of our time talking about fear in the book of Nehemiah. Now, why do we want to go to the book of Nehemiah? Nehemiah doesn't use the term fear as often as, say, the book of Deuteronomy or even the book of Psalms. Even Psalm 33 and 34, those twin Psalms, focus on the fear of God and say more about fear than the whole book of Nehemiah. So why go to the book of Nehemiah? Because Nehemiah described these people in the post-exile period as those who desired to fear your name, chapter 1, verse 11. We desire, we want to fear God. We do fear God and we want to fear God. So if I can go through the book and find a few qualities, that may give me some insight of what fear involves. They desire to fear your name. What did they do? So the passages we're about to mention don't all mention fear. Fear is mentioned elsewhere in the book, by the way, chapter 5, But in light of this statement, I'm going to take a look at the book of Nehemiah. So let's list some things. We don't have time to go in detail, so in the 5 minutes or so that remain, I want us just to peruse through the book. So if you don't have your Bible open, then open up to the book of Nehemiah. The first thing I take note of is that those who fear God are going to be concerned about the things of God. That Nehemiah, the text says that when I heard these words about the city being broken down and the walls burned with fire, I sat down and I wept and I mourned for many days. In other words, here's a man of God who hears the problem going on at Jerusalem, the distress that the city is in, and he sat down and wept. So those who fear God are concerned about spiritual things. Well, let's go further. Those who fear God view God as great and awesome. Look at verse 5. So he prayed, saying to the God of heaven, the great and awesome God. Those who fear God view God as great and awesome. Not as a nuisance who gives me rules that I don't like, but he's great and he's awesome. Thirdly, they see a need and they act upon it. Nehemiah went, chapter 2, and surveyed the city and saw that what was needed to be done, and then he rallied the people saying, let us rise up and build, and the people said, let us rise up and build. So those who are fearing God are those who see a need and they act upon it, rather than stand around with their hands in their pockets wondering if somebody's going to do anything. All right? Here's another principle. They diligently work. You remember chapter 3 is one of those chapters, as you read through Nehemiah, you get to, and it's one of those boring chapters, list name after name after name after name, and you can't pronounce them, and let's just skip that chapter and go on. No, it's an important chapter, very important. Because what it tells me is those who are doing the work. Would your name be listed there if you were living in that time? Look at verse 20. Look at verse 20. Here were those who diligently repaired. In contrast, by the way, to those that didn't put their shoulders to the work, verse 5. Those who fear God diligently work. Here's something else. Those who fear God work long and hard for the cause of the Lord. Chapter 4, verse 21. They had spears from day in their they labored, and half of the men held spears from daybreak till the stars appeared. From sun up to sundown they worked. Chapter 5, we've already noted that when Nehemiah said, you're exacting usury and you shouldn't do that, you should fear God, is what you should do. He's quoting from Leviticus 25. But I'm driving to get to this point in the last few moments we have, and that is those who fear God have respect for the Word of God. Show me somebody that doesn't have any real respect, deep abiding respect for the Word, the authority of the Word, and I'll show you somebody that really does not fear God. Now let's go to chapter 8. And we don't have time to go through each one of these points. I want to drive to one particular point from chapter 8, but I'm going to quickly list some others. In verse 2, verse 3, verse 7, verse 8, they listened with the intent of understanding. Ezra the scribe comes and stands up on a pulpit of wood, and he preaches and reads to them from the scriptures, and they listened with the intent of understanding because they fear God. They took time. They were attentive for half a day, the text says. They weren't rushed. Here's the point I want you to see. They stood at the opening of the book. Look at verse 5. And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above them, and when he opened it, all the people stood up. Do you think about that? Ezra comes along, and he opens the book in the sight of all the people, and it wasn't, oh, let's stand up. It's the great Ezra. Let's stand in his presence. But he's got it, the book. And when he opened the book in the sight of all the people stood up. I want to tell you, there's a few occasions in life when I come to my feet out of respect for what's going on. When the flag is unfurled and the national anthem is sung, I come to my feet. I've met and shook hands with 6 of the presidents, and when the President of the United States walks in to the room where you're sitting and sits down at the table where you are, you come to your feet. You just out of respect for who he is, his office. You just do that. Well, here's something worth more than the flag or the nation or the president, and that is he opened the book in the sight of all the people, And all the people stood up. It's the book. It's the word. I don't mean to imply by that when the book is open and I open the book or someone else stands before you that you've got to stand up in order to hear the reading of the law, but that suggests something of an attitude of the people, doesn't it? Is that descriptive of your attitude about the book of God? They stood at the opening of the book. And then later we see, beginning at verse 13, that they were willing to do what was found within the book. Now, I want us to move on to the conclusion, and our time is about up. What have we seen? We've talked about a number of things. I hope I've just whetted your appetite for more study on fear. We've seen what fear means. It's our purpose in life, some examples of those who fear God, fear found in the Pentateuch, and fear found in the book of Nehemiah. Now remember our twofold objective, and hopefully that's been accomplished, that we want to be more determined to walk in the fear of God. If I have created a greater desire in your heart by looking at these scriptures, then we've already had a successful meeting, haven't we? But secondly, if I could challenge you, every time you see the term fear, underline that and start raising the question, what did I learn about fear? You're going to have an interesting and rewarding study from this point forward. I appreciate your attention this morning.